War no longer begins at the front. It begins with doors locked from the inside, with windows taped over, and with children learning to stay silent before they learn to speak. That is why the most terrifying truth of modern wars is not found in calibers or strategies, but in a number that makes blood run cold. More than 90% of the dead are people who never swore an oath, never wore a uniform, and never chose to fight. "I am not a soldier," a man said, standing in the middle of his kitchen with a suitcase in his hands as the house shook from the impact. "I have no enemies. I have only a home, a job, and a family. And I don't understand why that is no longer enough to stay alive." No one answered him, because war does not hold conversations with civilians. It simply crosses out their arguments. When a missile hits a residential block, it does not check documents, does not ask who supports whom, does not distinguish between an order and a cradle. "They told us this wasn't aimed at us," a woman said in a basement, clutching a phone with a message that would never be delivered. "But if our neighbors are dying, if schools are disappearing, if a hospital becomes a target, then explain to me, who is this war against, if not against life itself?" In the 21st century, soldiers fight and civilians die. The front has dissolved into cities, and war has learned to strike at fear, at routine, at the ability to live a normal life. That is why most of the victims are those who woke up at home and did not live to see the evening, never becoming heroes, never even becoming participants. "They call us collateral damage," said an old man, his voice stripped of anger and left only with dignity. "But life is never collateral. If it was destroyed, then the strike was direct. It is simply more convenient for the world to pretend we were somewhere on the side." And in that moment it becomes clear. The first act of modern war is not the clash of armies, but the mass killing of those who had no voice. And as long as more than 90% of the dead are civilians, any talk of precision strikes and necessary losses sounds like a cold justification from a world that has learned to wage war in a way where those who die are not the ones who shoot, but the ones who were simply living. Missing file. Civilians, modern, she war, part 2 N Tai Kex. Over time, civilians stop waiting for justice because waiting kills as slowly as fear, and they begin to live in a constant state of farewell, where every morning may be the last, and every "see you later" sounds like a lie spoken out of love rather than hope. "I don't plan anymore," the woman said, looking at a calendar where all dates had lost their meaning. "Because a plan is faith in tomorrow, and faith here is dangerous. It hurts when an explosion comes before you have time to believe in anything." Children grow up in this shadow faster than their age should allow, and their questions are no longer about the future but about survival. Because when more than 90% of the dead are civilians, childhood becomes shorter than a night without an air raid siren. "If we sleep in the corridor, the chances are higher," the boy said seriously, as if quoting a textbook that should not exist. "And if we don't turn on the lights, they might not notice us. I'm not afraid, I'm just calculating, like you taught me." These words tear the silence apart harder than explosions, because they mean the war has already won something irreversible. It has taken from civilians the right to be naive, the right not to know what death sounds like, the right not to adapt to the abnormal. "The worst part isn't when they're shooting," said a man in the basement, holding his mother close. "The worst part is when you catch yourself thinking that today was quiet and you feel relief, as if silence were a gift and not the normal state. That's when you realize the war is already inside you." People begin to disappear not only from the lists of the living, but from the world's memory. Because the news moves on quickly, the numbers grow, and with every new tragedy, the previous one becomes yesterday's, as if pain had an expiration date. They say they've gotten used to it, the woman whispered, staring into the darkness. But getting used to it is not strength. It's a form of slow capitulation. Because if we get used to dying without uniforms and without orders, it means we've already been defeated. And it is here that the third act reaches its cruel truth. When more than 90% of the dead are civilians, war stops being a conflict between armies and becomes a process of breaking everyday life, where everyone who survives carries an invisible sentence, to go on living with the knowledge that what saved them was not law, not protection, not justice, but chance, and that knowledge haunts longer than any shelling. Missing file, civilians, modern, Shiu's war, part, stags. When the war seems to end, civilians do not go out to celebrate, because they know that the word end no longer means safety in their lives, and the silence after the explosion sounds not like victory, but like a test, a check of whether they have deceived themselves once again by believing that the worst is over. They say there is peace now, the woman said, standing among the ruins of the building that used to be her address. But if I still flinch at footsteps, if my children wake up from their own breathing, if my eyes search for shelter even in daylight, then explain to me, where exactly is the peace here? The world begins reconstruction, counting losses, drafting diplomatic language. But civilians do not fit into these frameworks, because their losses do not end when the fighting stops. They continue in trauma, in broken families, in bodies that no longer remember how to live without fear. That is why the number over 90% does not disappear even after a ceasefire. We survived, a man said quietly, but survival is not a gift, it is a burden, because now we have to live with the question of why us, and why those who did not fight became the main price of this war. Children return to school but count exits. Adults return to work but do not make plans. And it becomes clear that war took from civilians not only lives, but the sense of normality. And this theft almost never appears in official reports. I don't want this to happen again, the woman said with a dignity that is born only from pain. Not here, not to us, not to others. Because if the world continues to accept civilian deaths as an acceptable price, it condemns itself to endlessly repeating this horror. The final truth of this story is not in signed agreements or news summaries, but in a simple and uncomfortable reality. A war in which more than 90% of the dead are civilians cannot be called a mistake or an accident. It is a consciously broken reality, where life without weapons has lost its protection. And if humanity truly wants to stop wars, it must begin with one painful recognition. Every modern war that kills mostly civilians is a defeat not only for the sides of the conflict, but for the entire world that allowed this to become normal.